in leading advocacy efforts to reauthorize the Workforce Investment Act will unpack the recently introduced Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. We will hear from National Skills Coalition, Workforce Data Quality Campaign, CLASP, National Youth Employment Coalition, and Young Invincibles. We've got a lot to cover this afternoon, and we want to make sure to make time for your questions. So without further delay, I'm pleased to turn it over to National Skills Coalition's Federal Policy Director, Rachel Gragg. Rachel?
Thanks, Jen. So I want to thank everybody for getting on the call. We have a ton of people, which I think reflects the interest in this legislation. I also want to thank everybody who is presenting on today's call. We have a lot of expertise, and hopefully we can give you a good overview of what's in the bill and answer some of your questions. I'm Rachel Gragg. I'm the Federal Policy Director with National Skills Coalition. We also have Neil Ridley from CLASP, Mala Thakur from the National Youth Employment Center, Jennifer Wang with Young Invincibles, and Rachel Zinn with the Workforce Data Quality Campaign. And we're each going to take a little slice of what's in the bill and try and give you a relatively, probably a little bit broader overview. We won't go too far into some of the details just because we don't have time to cover everything, but we'll do the best that we can. And again, if you have questions and we haven't answered it by the time we get to the end, please don't hesitate to ask. So I'm going to start with just a general overview of the legislation and then talk a little bit about some of the key sort of broad changes that were made. So it is a bipartisan, bicameral bill. It has support from all of the key policymakers on the House and the Senate, both Democrats and Republicans. It also has support from leadership. So that's a really good sign. And I really don't want to underestimate how hard it is to get a bicameral, bipartisan bill done in this Congress. So this is not an insignificant accomplishment. And hopefully it's a good sign for the likelihood that we'll be able to move this bill forward. The bill does reauthorize WIOA for 6 years, so beginning in program year 2015 through 2020. And the general focus of the bill is on sort of streamlining things like programs and reporting and administration. So it's really an effort to, I think, make WIOA and the set of programs under WIOA function better. Will you go to the next slide, Jen? So again, a little more broad overview. The bill, the way that it's written, it does maintain the existing structure of the law. So we keep the same 4 titles. So Title I, the occupational training title, Title II, the adult basic ed, family literacy, and ESL title, Title III, the Wagner-Kaiser employment services, and Title IV, the vocational rehabilitation title. That's not changed. It also maintains the existing funding structure. So if you remember the original bill that was taken up by the House, the Skills Act, it did create essentially a block grant where they combined funding for about 35 programs into a single block grant. That is not what was brought into this bill, WIOA. No block grant. Funding streams are not consolidated, so we still have an adult funding stream, a youth funding stream, and a dislocated worker funding stream on Title I. We still have separate Title I funding streams and Title II funding streams. So we did not get that kind of consolidation that I know some people were concerned about. Next slide, Jen. What did happen, though, in this bill is it does eliminate 15 existing programs, and you can see the list here. I'm not going to read through the whole thing. Just so though you can see, of the 15 programs, as best we can sort of tell, there are only 3 of them that are currently funded. We do lose the WIA Incentive Grant and the Workforce Innovation Fund. And what I've done here, so the ones that are in red in this list, those are the ones that are currently funded. So also the TAA healthcare gap coverage is currently funded. All the others are programs that are authorized but have not been funded, are not currently funded, and for the most part have not been funded for at least a couple of years. The ones that are here in blue, these are vocational rehabilitation programs. I just didn't have space to write under vocational rehabilitation for each one of these. So the blue ones, it's not the National Migrant and Seasonal Farm Workers Program. It's the Migrant and Seasonal Farm Workers Program under vocational rehabilitation, projects with industry under voc rehab, recreational programs under voc rehab, and in-service training under voc rehab. So, you know, in general, it is probably not as damaging as it could have been for these programs to have been eliminated, just because, for the most part, they have not been funded, and given the current fiscal situation, it's unlikely that we would get funding for them anytime soon. I will say, National Skills Coalition, we do regret, if we do lose the Workforce Innovation Fund and the WIOA incentive grants, we do regret losing that funding because we do think it's flexible funding intended to drive innovation. So we would have preferred to see that funding protected, but this is the list that we got. Next slide, Jen. So just in terms of the process and the timing, the Senate is going to act first. The House has already passed WIOA once. They passed the Skills Act in 2013. The Senate brought a bill through committee but has not ever brought a bill to the floor. So the Senate will go first. As we understand it, they are trying to actually get a unanimous consent agreement, which is an expedited process that limits debate and amendments. It could actually, if they can get an agreement, they could actually move the bill without ever actually bringing it to the floor for debate. If everybody just agrees that the bill is okay the way that it is, they could just get a unanimous consent agreement to essentially deem the bill passed. I don't know if they'll be able to get that. I don't have a good sense. Again, because it is bipartisan, bicameral, because you do have the support of leadership. I think it's possible. I just don't know. And again, this is a pretty contentious Congress, so you just really never have a good sense of how easy or hard it's going to be to advance a bill. But the House will wait for the Senate to act one way or another. I think that they will try and bring the bill through the Senate, even if they have to get floor time. My hope is that they will try and do that sometime in June, but I would think probably they will try sometime this summer for sure. And then once the Senate passes it, and I do think that if the Senate is likely to be able to pass this bill, it is not my sense. I have not heard great, strong outcry or objection to this bill. So I do hope that the Senate will be able to pass the bill as it's written or very close to as it's written. And then when the Senate acts, if the Senate acts, then the House will follow the Senate. There is an expedited process on the House side called the suspension calendar. It requires 2/3 of the vote to pass, but it also sort of limits debate and amendments. And it's possible that the House could try and move the bill on the suspension calendar. So you could, in theory, get a very expedited process. If everything sort of went as smoothly as possible, you could move the bill through this expedited process on both the House and the Senate side. We don't know that that's what will happen, and again, because Washington is not particularly highly functional, there's always the risk that something will go wrong or will get bogged down in other bigger political fights. But we're pretty well positioned, I think, to see this bill move, and hopefully we will not get stuck, particularly for unrelated reasons. And again, it could potentially go pretty quickly if nothing goes wrong. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the big changes that were made in the bill. So for the WIBs, there was conversation at one point about sort of changing some of the structure of the WIB, both the House and the Senate, at different points considered some relatively significant changes. That really did not come into the final bill. So it mostly maintains the existing structure with a business majority and a business chair. The one sort of significant change that it made is it does reduce the number of required members. The state and the local plans there was a lot of work done around this issue of state plans and local plans, and this is one of sort of the bigger changes that is done in the bill. So now it will require a new unified state plan for all core programs, and core programs just means the programs that are authorized under the bill. So across all 4 titles, you'll now have one unified state plan for all of the programs that are authorized under those titles. And the idea is that hopefully this will drive better alignment across the programs and get different agencies talking to each other and really starting to think about how do we build a workforce development system that's not siloed, where Title I and Title II are talking to each other, and you're really having much smoother access and transitions for people who are moving through these programs. And then for the local plans, they have to be aligned with the state plans. The American Job Centers, which is what the one-stop centers are now called, there's a new activity for the American Job Centers again. So the state WIB has to set or help define a set of measures that then the one-stop centers can use to assess their effectiveness, accountability, and continuous improvement at least every 3 years. Again, I think the idea is that this is really meant to help sort of streamline and improve operations at the service delivery level. So around employment and training activities, there were also some changes. One of the biggest ones, and other people are going to talk about this in more detail, but we are now going to, again, common performance measures across all core programs. So you can see it's not, hopefully this, it will not be so fragmented, it will not be so sort of separated. Across all the core programs, so Title I, Title II, 3, and 4, there are one set of common measures for adult programs and one set of common measures for the core programs. And we'll circle back to that. I think both Neil and Rachel Zinn will be talking about those. It also codifies the elimination of the sequence of services, which is great. I think most people have been operating without the sequence of services for a long time, but this is an important signal that it doesn't have to be this sort of sequential process, but you can move people through as quickly as you need to. And instead of having core and intensive services, now you have this new career services category, which excuse me, which again hopefully makes it more seamless for individuals seeking services. And then the bill also signals to states and local areas an increased interest in a number of best practices. There's a lot of focus on career pathways. There's good focus on sector partnerships. And there's a lot of emphasis on credential attainment linked to in-demand occupations. So really trying to make sure not only that people are getting credentials, which in and of itself is an important signal, but that those credentials are then linked to real jobs in the local community. And then in terms of the funding, so this is also, there were some significant changes made to the funding as well. The statewide set-aside is restored to 15%. A couple years ago through the appropriations process, it was cut to 5%. This will put it back at 15%. Hopefully states, because we will lose at the federal level, if we lose the innovation fund and the incentive grants, you know, that was flexible funding that was starting to be used to drive some innovation. If we lose that, I do think that the statewide set-aside will become even more important, potentially even more important, to really help states try and really, you know, lift up and build out capacity for some of the best practices and some of the more innovative practices that we're starting to see take hold. The other big change that they made, and this is again, this is not a small change. So under current law, the authorized funding levels are such sums, and that just basically says to the appropriators, well, it should be as much as you need to run this program. They changed in WIOA, they changed so they actually now specify in each year, FY15 through FY20, the specific funding level for each one of those years. And in general, so most people are aware, we have lost a lot of money for workforce programs since about FY10. We've really seen, you know, sort of a precipitous drop in funding levels because of the budget caps and the sequesters. The authorized funding levels do try and move back towards those pre-sequester levels. So by FY17, the authorized amount is back to where we were in FY10. I do feel like, though, I would be remiss if I didn't stress to people that what's in the bill is only an authorization level. It's not the actual funding level. It's just saying to the appropriators, here's where we think you should be funding this program in each of these years. But we do have to go through the appropriations process each year, and it will be up to the appropriators to figure out, well, are we going to fund it at that level? In theory, they could fund it above the level. They can definitely fund it below the specified level. And I do feel strongly that unless Congress undoes the budget caps and does something about the sequester cuts, it's unlikely that we will be able to go back to even FY10 levels, just because the overall funding levels are just so low that there's just not enough money to go around, and the appropriators are always having to make these very difficult decisions. And any increase in funding for one program comes out of another program. So it's great. It's a good, important signal that the authorizers set these higher funding levels, but we will still have a lot of work to do with the appropriators to try and get the actual authorized funding levels to get that funding restored. So that's a very quick, broad overview, and I'm sure people have lots of detailed questions, and like I said, we'll try and get to those. But I also want to just flag a resource for people. We just finished an updated side-by-side that now includes this new WIOA. So you can see current law, you can see the Senate bill that was reported through committee, you can see the House bill, which is the Skills Act that was passed on the floor, and then you can see in the last column, you can see WIOA. So you can sort of get a sense at a very detailed level about what's going on under a bunch of different provisions. On the slide down at the bottom, you can see the link, and we will send this PowerPoint presentation will be available, so you'll have access to that link as well. So you can get as much detail as you want. But with that, and I know we went pretty fast, but with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Neil now so he can talk about some of the provisions that are connected to opportunities for low-income adults and youth.
Thank you, Rachel. We really think that WIOA, the reauthorization bill that's in front of us, includes a number of changes that are likely to improve access and hopefully outcomes for low-income adults and youth and those facing challenges in the labor market. If it, actually, if you could go back a slide there. If it goes through, we think it's a chance to move forward for the field to focus on implementing promising strategies such as career pathways that have emerged during the past decade. So CLASP is a national organization, and we work on policies to improve the lives of low-income workers and families. We work on not just workforce and post-secondary issues, but also child care, early childhood education, and many other areas. Okay, great. So as Rachel mentioned, the bill includes, Title I in the bill includes a number of cross-program requirements that apply to the core programs that she mentioned. And I think the front end of the bill in particular has a lot of new content, and it sends important signals for workforce and education programs going forward. There's a new definition of individuals with barriers to employment, and the definition includes a range of individuals who are facing barriers or challenges: low-income individuals, homeless, ex-offenders, and long-term unemployed workers. And this definition, and it's important to note, shows up in a number of places: in a sharper purpose statement at the beginning, in the comprehensive planning requirements that states and local areas have to address, and then also in performance accountability and reporting. And then, as Rachel mentioned, there's clear recognition of career pathways as a promising approach to aligning services that are funded by different programs and offered by different providers. I would say career pathways really shows up pretty strongly in Title I and in Title II. Okay. So just a quick explanation of career pathways. Career pathways are gaining traction, and they're a way of bringing together a number of different programs and funding streams to help individuals at different skill levels earn credentials and find jobs. Career pathways should provide multiple entry points for individuals to provide access to those who might have low basic skills or need to improve their English language skills before entering on an occupational training program. And career pathways offer connected education and training services, so they really pull together services offered by different programs and providers and at different levels, and also provide complementary supports. And career pathways, of course, have to lead to in-demand jobs in industries that need workers. So as Rachel mentioned, the bill creates a new performance accountability section, which in some ways is one of the departures, one of the big departures from WIA. And in a specific departure from WIA, the bill requires that performance standards or levels be adjusted to take into account economic conditions in state and local areas and the characteristics of those being served. And this is likely to be an important change or helpful change because it should help reduce disincentives to serving individuals who may need more assistance or greater assistance to enter the workforce or complete an education and training program. There's also increased transparency and reporting in the bill. So states and local areas have to report on numbers served and outcomes disaggregated by the type of barrier that the individual faces. And there's also a lot of other helpful reporting information. One of the new indicators, it's important to note, is a progress indicator or interim indicator that shows participants who are making measurable skill gains toward a credential or employment. And this is really, this is an important measure for a number of reasons, and in some ways novel, but it should help ensure that providers and programs continue to focus on serving individuals with low levels of literacy and English language learners. So let's turn now to workforce services covered by Title I. So first of all, there's much greater focus on serving disconnected youth in this proposed reauthorization bill, and the two panelists that follow me are going to cover this in much greater depth and detail. So I'm going to move on, and the bill authorizes a wider range of services for adults and dislocated workers. Oh, actually go back for a moment. The bill authorizes a wider range of services and for adults and dislocated workers. And for example, local areas can use a portion of funds now to provide transitional job opportunities for those with limited work experience and other barriers to employment, to help them get a foot in the door and in the workforce. Also, it solidifies the authority to use contracts to train groups of participants, and of course that's very much in line with current appropriations authority. Supportive services are still in the mix for individuals who need help to complete education and training programs, and there's also more flexibility to serve working adults who may need additional help to retain jobs and advance in the workforce. Title II covers adult education and literacy services, including English language services, and these services provide important on-ramps for individuals with low basic skills and those who need to improve English language skills as well. The bill in Title II makes it clear that transitions to post-secondary education and employment are central goals of the program. So this is an important change in Title II. And there's strong support here, as in Title I, for career pathways. And there's also much more support for integrated education and training strategies that combine basic skills instruction with occupational and workforce preparation. And then finally, the bill reinforces alignment of adult education programs with workforce partners through the planning requirements, performance requirements, and the one-stop system. So all in all, the bill really has a number of helpful improvements in many areas, and programs should be, if it goes through, programs should be better positioned to meet job seekers and adult learners where they are. And there's a lot more support for promising strategies such as career pathways that have emerged since WIA was enacted back in 1998.
Okay, thanks, Neil. So now we're going to hear about some of the youth provisions. We're going to start with Mala, and then Jennifer Wang from Young Invincibles is going to follow her.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Rachel, for organizing this session and including all of the different focuses of the bill. I'm going to talk about some of the key youth provisions. So the National Youth Employment Coalition is a national network that works at the intersection of workforce development, youth development, and education. Here's a little bit about who our members are and the focus of our work, which is really focusing on improving programs and organizations that help young people connect to pathways that lead to a living wage. And our work is focused on policy, quality standards, professional development, and capacity building. So I thought it would be helpful to talk a little bit about where we started with our recommendations from the youth perspective on the bill. To Neil and Rachel's point, so there are a lot of improvements in the bill, we believe, particularly in the youth title and the youth provisions. And when we originally started with our recommendations, and themes, we focused on a few areas. Eligibility, with a particular focus on income and age, performance measures and program elements. Program elements, really looking at programs that are rooted in best practices and youth development principles for young people, and really emphasized measuring progress over time, which we'll get into in a minute. We had a series of recommendations and principles around funding and formula. Really maintaining the youth formula was a key recommendation for us. And then some recommendations and principles around capacity building, which focused on local flexibility, building a data infrastructure, and offering multiple pathways to secondary and post-secondary credentials. We also had a recommendation around maintaining youth councils or an entity that supported youth within the local system. You can take a look at the extensive recommendations where we started, and there's a link below to those recommendations. Not all of the recommendations are in the bill, but many of them are, and these are recommendations that we developed with our network and our partners. So as we fast forward several years to the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, you'll see some of these themes in the youth provisions of the bill, which, again, we believe support improvements and better programming. One of the key themes is really around funding. This bill maintains a separate youth funding stream and also funding streams for Youth Build and Job Corps. In the previous iteration of the House bill, the youth title was not separate. So we think that this is a great improvement and a key theme in the bill. And it really reflects a recognition that youth programs are different than adult programs and require a separate emphasis. There is a priority on low-income young people, on underserved populations, with a particular emphasis on out-of-school youth. And can you go back for just a second? And we believe that this priority and this theme in this bill could be helpful and provide some opportunities with other reauthorizations focused on low-income youth populations. Go ahead. Another key theme is around systems alignment. There are more direct and intentional linkages to secondary, post-secondary education and career pathways, as you've heard before today. I think that provides more opportunities, again, to connect systems and develop a continuum from workforce and education and other systems for young people. And then in terms of skill attainment, there is a real opportunity to capture and measure progress over time and incremental gains and really meet young people where they are. You can go to the next slide. So here are some more specific provisions within the bill as we go beyond the themes that I think would be important to pay attention to. One is around income eligibility for out-of-school youth. This has been an issue in current law, and in the new bill, the determination of income eligibility is streamlined and simplified. So I think there will be more or less disincentives to serve the population. Free and reduced lunch is part of the definition of low-income individual. There is also a special rule which allows eligibility also for those living in high poverty areas. The upper age range for out-of-school youth activities has been expanded to 24. It's currently 21 in current law. And also there is an expansion of priority for out-of-school youth with 75% of the funding for youth activities to serve this population. The bill also includes progress measures to capture incremental gains, which a few of us have talked about a bit. I think this is a great improvement for all youth who are served through youth programs. You can really measure gains and really begin and develop programs where a young person is starting. And I think it creates an incentive to serve a variety of populations through the bill. There is also a focus on local youth programming through the youth councils in areas where the youth councils have been very effective, and if not, require some sort of youth-focused entity in local communities. And we believe that this is important because youth programs, are different than adult programming, and usually if there isn't some sort of entity focused on youth, a lot of the youth programming and the development of those programs gets buried in the larger system. The new bill, maintains and expands the program elements, and while there are more elements, programs are required to provide access to these elements, but all of the elements may not be required for every young person, and that might be something that we want to talk about later. The new bill also requires, and this is different, that 20% of the funds support paid and unpaid work experiences as those that are listed there. So there is a real emphasis on work experience, which we have supported and we feel is integral to making connections for young people in the workplace. So just a couple of other things, and then I'll just turn it over to the next presenter. We are going to take a slightly deeper dive on the youth provisions. On Friday, we have two representatives from the Senate Health Committee and the Education and Workforce Committee in the House who will be providing an overview from the youth perspective in the bill on Friday, June 6th at 2 p.m. And we'll be sending some additional information following this webinar. Yeah, that was the only additional announcement. So I'll turn it over to you, Jen.
Thank you so much, Mala. I wanted to thank the other panelists and also all of you for joining our call. Mala and the folks at the National Youth Employment Coalition have really taken the lead on advocacy through their work on themes and definitions to ensure that youth are best served through WIOA. I'm still getting used to the acronym. So to that, I'd like to thank Mala and her team, but I'd like to focus my portion of the youth presentation on real-world implications and examples of how the bill would help youth in their communities and really, like Neil said, meet them where they are. But first, Young Invincibles, my organization, is a national nonprofit committed to mobilizing and expanding opportunities for young Americans 18 to 34 on issues like higher education, healthcare, and jobs. Some examples of our work as they apply to jobs in the economy, or one example rather, is that last year we conducted a 15-state jobs tour where we visited many WIA-funded programs across the country to learn more from youth who are currently in these programs and youth who had left these programs to get a good sense of how this funding specifically helps them in their communities. And we learned a lot during that tour. We learned a lot about the program specifically in reconnecting youth and providing them with skills and opportunities that they would have otherwise not had. I just want to reiterate what Mala said about the specific funding for youth. It was great for us to see that the specific funding remained, that the title remained, that the programs were targeted, and that there was very, very little consolidation in the youth section. Next slide, please. I also like to reiterate what Neil said about the more adaptive system to help youth. And I wanted to highlight just several examples of programs that Young Invincibles has seen work that WIOA actually directly has a hand in funding and improving. The first one is Job Corps, and many of you will be familiar with this, but Job Corps is a free education and training program that helps young people learn a career, perhaps earn a high school diploma or a GED, and find and keep a good job. And WIOA funds this program that helps young people 16 years old and above that are low income gain all-around skills. The next program that I'd like to highlight are pre-apprenticeships and apprenticeships. These are programs that really directly connect young people to on-the-job learning. Often these programs are paid and are very much tailored to the skills that young people need in specific fields. And we've seen them work. We've visited many apprenticeship programs where young people are giving us feedback like it's the best thing they've ever done. And so we were thrilled to see that WIOA continues to support that. The next program I'd like to highlight is National Service. And these are programs that can prepare young adults for long-term employment opportunities in both the public and private sector. But what's great about them is that they create full-time positions that are paid for by both public and private resources that really give young people opportunities to do very meaningful work in their communities as they prepare for other jobs down the line. Like Mala touched on in one of her slides, WIOA funds summer and year-round job programs. It also funds mentoring. And the next program that I'd like to go a little bit more in depth on is Youth Build. Youth Build, which many Youth Build centers actually we visited during our jobs tour, but Youth Build helps low-income young people ages 16 to 24 work full-time for a short period of time, maybe 6 to 12 months, toward their high school diploma or toward their GED while learning job skills by building affordable housing in their communities. And so it's just another example of how these programs are really connecting on-the-job learning with education opportunities, with real skill building like the other panelists have mentioned. And the last thing that I'll mention is that WIOA supports activities at the state level. So anything from research on youth to building new programs. Next slide, please. These are just photos from our jobs tour. These are actually taken on site at programs that are funded through WIA and would continue to be funded through WIOA. And I thought to include them here just for some visuals. Next slide, please. And I'd like to also reiterate what Rachel said about funding. So as you all have heard from Rachel, the funding caps or the funding levels in WIOA are very different. In WIA, they were such sums, but they are now specific levels. But I will reiterate that, like Rachel said, unless we undo the budget caps, these levels are still up to appropriators. But I did want to specifically include these levels, and you can see we'd be back at the 2010 level for, I believe, youth funding by 2017. And that should just give you all a sense of where we'll be between now and 2020. Next slide. And that concludes my portion of the presentation. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, Mala and Jen. That was very helpful. And so now we're going to turn it over to our last speaker, Rachel Zinn from the WD2C. And then once Rachel finishes up, we'll open up for questions and any comments you all have.
Great, thanks. So first, just a little bit about the WDQC. We're a nonprofit. We advocate for inclusive, aligned, and market-relevant data systems that can help us make sure that our workforce and education policies are really effectively training people for jobs in demand. We work at both the federal and state level, and our policy agenda has been developed by a broad coalition of partner organizations that include National Skills Coalition and CLASP, who are on the call today. Just want to highlight a couple of data and accountability things from WIOA. So first of all, the performance metrics, which some of the other speakers have touched on, the same metrics across all the programs, which really helps align the data systems and allow for greater collaboration between the programs. There's slight shifts in the employment metrics from kind of the current common measures that are in use for Title I. They're measured at different times. So they're measured, right now we measure at the first quarter after program exit. Now we measure at the second quarter for entered employment. And instead of having a retention measure, we just measure at the fourth quarter after exit. So it's a shift from entered employment and employment retention to looking at a short-term and a long-term employment, although long-term is still only 4 quarters. Also, now adults are all subject to measures of credential attainment and skill gains. There's also a requirement that there be a metric that measures the effectiveness of the workforce system in serving employers. The methodology for that metric hasn't been decided yet. The bill directs DOL and the Departments of Labor and Education to collaborate on coming up with the definition for that metric. Some things that states have used and that policy experts have thought about, things like the number of employers engaged in sector partnerships, the percent of employers who are engaged in the system 1 year and come back the next year. So there's a lot of options there. And the last thing to note on the performance metrics is that although the core measures are required for all the programs, none of the programs can get rid of any of these measures. States can add additional metrics if they have other things that they want to measure. Next. These metrics are required to be reported publicly. The bill really calls for, they call them performance reports, but they're probably going to end up being almost like scorecards for states, local areas, and for training providers. In the next, the bill directs Departments of Education and Labor to design a template for these for this performance information, with the idea being that people should be able to look at a standardized format to be able to compare across states or training providers for the same group of programs. The law is pretty prescriptive about what these reports are supposed to contain. Some of the things they need to include are information about numbers of people served, including, as Neil mentioned, those with barriers to employment, information about the services received, average cost of services, which is new, co-enrollment, participant outcomes. So a final thing to note on the public reporting is that training providers have to report on their outcomes for all participants, not just those participants funded by vouchers through the workforce system. So this has been somewhat controversial in the past and in previous iterations of the bill, but according to this, training providers are going to need to figure out how to measure the outcomes, including employment outcomes for all participants. So what are the data implications of having to report all of this new information? So states are now directed to use wage records to measure performance. That was always the case in Title I, but now it applies to all the programs for state and local performance. So wage records are submitted to the state by employers as part of the unemployment insurance system. States already collect this information. They already have them. And states can connect some of this data to find the workforce participants, find their wage information, including earnings, and looking at whether they show up in the wage records to see whether they're employed. Most states already use wage records for all the WIOA programs. One challenge is getting wage records from other states to capture people who move across state lines or may have gotten training in one state and work across the border in another state. The U.S. Department of Labor does administer a system that enables exchange of wage records for performance reporting, so that may be an avenue to get these outcomes reported accurately. A note on the credential measure. So the credential attainment is inclusive. So it's not just talking about certificates or degrees issued by an education provider. You can also include licenses issued by the state or credentials awarded by industry partnerships or employers. Because those kinds of credentials are awarded outside the traditional education system, a lot of states don't have that data right now, so they would have to get that information by surveying participants. But there are some pilot efforts to connect that data into state systems to be able to track that kind of information more efficiently and effectively. There's also a few things in the bill about evaluation, another brand of accountability. So states are directed to conduct program evaluations on the workforce system. That's a carryover from current law, but there is a new requirement to cooperate with federal research. There's also new mandates for adult education research and evaluation. States are now required to use some of their set-aside funds for adult education to carry out research. And in addition, the U.S. Department of Education must do an independent evaluation of adult education programs at least once every 4 years. And finally, there are some pieces in the bill about labor market information. Of course, statistics about the labor market are important to make sure that the career counselors and training providers can gear their advice and their programs to preparing students for careers that are really in demand. So to try to strengthen the system, the federal-state collaborative system that produces labor market information, the bill establishes a new Workforce Information Advisory Council, and that's part of Title III, the Wagner-Peiser title. Now, current law does require consultations between the Department of Labor and state representatives, and there is a current advisory council that exists, and that's primarily made up of state labor market information directors. The new law diversifies the council membership. So now the council appointed by the secretary would include state experts on workforce programs, labor market information and economic development, as well as representatives of business and the research community. One sort of conspicuous omission in that list of experts is experts on higher education. But there might be ways to bring them into the conversation as well. The law also formalizes the role of the council, requiring specified input into policy. So the Secretary of Labor, through both the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the Employment and Training Administration, would now have to consult with the council at least twice a year to talk about the statistical system and take their advice on improving labor market information. That's also a more formal role for the Employment and Training Administration than in current law. So again, it kind of shifts the focus from just the producers of this data to programs and other stakeholders who use the data. Great. Thank you very much. I think we're going to open it up for questions.
That's right. Thanks, Rachel. And I realize I want to make one more comment that I probably should have covered in the general overview. Really two related comments. So first, there is a 2-year transition period. So those of you who are sort of on the ground doing this work, this is not something where you're going to have to shift gears, you know, from one day to the next. The bill does specifically allow this sort of space to start to figure out how to implement some of these changes. I also do want to stress, this is really it feels like a lot of us have been doing this for a really, really long time. But this is sort of, if this bill does pass, this is really not the end of this work. It's in some ways it's the beginning of the next phase. There will be considerable work left to be done after, when this bill passes, both at the national level with the agencies, Department of Labor, Department of Education. Hopefully we'll also see other agencies like Commerce and HHS part of these conversations. But really in terms of writing the regulations and the guidance and how you implement some of this, and also then at the state level, there's going to be a significant state and local role in implementation as well. So there's still a lot of room for conversation and a lot of things that we'll have to sort through even once the bill passes. So I don't want to leave people with the impression that it's going to be this super speeded up process where we just get a bill and press go. So, but with that, yes, let's open it up for any questions that people have.
While we're waiting for hands, we have a question that was typed in by Damon, and he's wondering how will the new system improve access to and for TANF recipients and other individuals with barriers to employment.
Neil, do you want to respond to that? Neil, you might be on mute.
There we go. Yes, as I talked a little bit about in my presentation, there are a number of helpful changes, especially in the services for adults and dislocated workers. In particular, I think there's a much wider range of services that's going to be appropriate for those with limited work experience, those that TANF recipients and others that do need additional help getting the first job, getting into the workforce. So, for example, there are, as I mentioned, there's much more room to do transitional job opportunities, which are really helpful employment opportunities for those that tend to have less work experience, that may have multiple barriers to employment, and they've been basically tried out for the last 10 years since WIA was enacted, and now if this goes through, they'll be recognized in this new reauthorization bill. So that's just one example. There's also much more room to do upgrade training for entry-level workers as well that we didn't have a chance to talk about. And then, of course, there's some of the additional provisions I mentioned around supportive services and services for working adults who may not be able to come into one-stops during the regular hours.
Thanks, Neil. We have a question from Alana Tweet. Alana, I will open up your line now. Alana, you can go ahead. Okay, she may not be there. Okay, so I'll open up James Parker. You can go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much. Just like to hear your speculation as to whether Title II with this new legislation would be regulated. You'll remember in 1998-99, someone chose not to regulate Title II, and I think that was detrimental to program advancement. So any thoughts on that?
So Jim, your phone line kind of cut out, but since I know that you're actually the Title II expert, if you want to comment on that, if you guys have a concern, we'd be interested in hearing your take on it.
Oh, my take on it?
Yes. So.
Well, I'm just wondering.
Well,
I'm hoping that regulations will be required for implementing Title II to give the field a chance to comment on the legislation and the implementation of it. That didn't happen in 1999.
So I don't have a good answer to that. I do think that there's new attention and new focus to adult basic education. There's good leadership in the agency with the recent PIAC data. the OECD report that shows that the United States lags significantly behind other developed countries in terms of adult basic skills, and that it has a greater consequence for people in the United States than it does in other countries when they lag behind. I do think that people in the agency are very focused on that. They're very aware of it. I think the White House is very aware of it. So, you know, I guess my expectation would be that you would get regulations if for no other reason than I think that there's a real interest in improving and strengthening these programs, but I have not had a conversation with the agency. I can't speak for the agency, so you know, I don't feel like I'm qualified to answer that conversation directly. I don't know, Neil, if you guys have talked to them at all or have any sense.
No, we don't really have a better sense of that.
So there you go. We don't know.
I guess a follow-up question would be, who decides that? Is it Congress or is it the administration as to whether a bill, a section will be regulated?
Well, usually, you know, regs have to, it's very difficult to most states how to run a program without regulations. I don't actually know the answer to that question. I assume it's at the agency's initiative, but I don't actually know the answer to that question.
I don't either.
Okay, thank you, James.
Mm-hmm.
All right, our next question is from Gina Galvan. Gina, I'm opening up your line. Go ahead.
Do you want to ask it? Yes, we're on right now. That's the question.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
If the bill is passed this year, House, what would be the implementation date for WIOA?
So you're asking if the bill is passed this year?
Correct.
What would be the implementation date? So again, Neil and I were actually talking about this last week. I don't. Neil, were you able to look at some of the dates?
I think it would be for most parts of the bill July 1, 2015, but there are different dates for different sections, including the planning, some of the state and local planning, and of course youth programs would start. The youth program year starts April 1st, so really there would be a rolling set of dates. I think that's the simplest answer.
What I will say is I think if the bill passed, you know, people should not panic or feel overly concerned because it is a little bit, the timing could potentially be a little bit strange, right? So for adult and dislocated workers, for example, the program year starts on July 1st. If they passed it in June, that could have one implication. If they waited into July, that could have another implication. I think the reality is nobody's gonna. It's my expectation is that people would sort of sort some of that through, and you know, if it passes on July 1st, I don't think that that's going to trigger sort of a mass, you must act right this second. I don't think that's anybody's intention.
Rachel, this is Mala. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
On the youth dates, the program year is what you were referring to, Neil. I mean, that the program year would likely be July 1st, and the April date is more for the allocations.
So we are all more or less on that July to July.
All right. Thank you, Gina. Okay, our next question is from Jack Mills. Jack, I'm opening up your line now. You can go ahead.
Thanks so much. I had a question on the sector partnerships aspects of the bill. Can you talk about what the bill says and how it funds sector partnerships?
Sure. So it does not fund sector partnerships. Although with the restoration of the state set-aside, we do know that some states were using that 15% funds to support industry or sector partnerships before it was reduced to the 5%. So we certainly hope that with the funding restored, we would see some states go back to that. Most of them had to stop when it was reduced. So there is not specific designated funding for industry partnerships. There is definitely some signaling to states that there is an interest in seeing more or expanded, certainly employer engagement. There's a lot of focus on employer engagement, but there is also attention to specifically industry partnerships as you know, a best practice for employer engagement. So in their state plans, states do have to describe how they will engage employers, including through industry or sector partnerships. In the local plans, the local areas do have to describe how they will convene, partner with, I don't remember the exact language, but they essentially have to say how they will use, convene, or partner with industry partnerships, which is good. You know, we hope that that is good, strong language. There is a definition of an industry or sector partnership in the bill as well. And then I think in particular the employer engagement measure, which is not defined in the bill, but again, as Rachel Zinn mentioned, is left to the Departments of Labor and Education to develop a methodology for establishing that measure. I do think that you could really drive state and local areas towards industry and sector partnerships through that measure as well. You know, I think we know pretty well from experience that what we measure is what matters. So we will continue to work with the agencies to try and make sure that it reflects that sort of best practice around industry or sector partnerships.
All right, our next question is from Michael Brett. Michael, I'm opening up your line. Okay, I think we lost him. Next question is from Sylvia Arnold. Sylvia, you can go ahead. All right, it doesn't look like Sylvia is there. Next question is from Judith Renier. Judith, you can go ahead.
Would you be able to share with us the side-by-side comparison?
Yes, so we actually, in the reminder email that you got this morning, there is a link to the side-by-side.
Oh, great. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Okay, next question is from Brent Parton. Brent, you can go ahead.
Yes, this is Brent Parton, National Governors Association. Wanting to go a little bit deeper into what was mentioned, I think, in the first youth presentation about the 20% funding requirement to support work experience. Interested if you could put that in perspective a little bit, now from the standpoint of what's the current level, how that relates to the current known level of expenditure in that area, or what the past requirements were, as well as how exactly that tends to be quantified and measured. Thank you.
Sure, Brent. This is Mala, and currently, you know, there is no requirement of that kind in current law. They are eligible activities, paid and unpaid work experiences, but there isn't a requirement. So it is, you know, it is different, and it would be out of, you know, the current funds. There aren't additional funds, you know, for that 20%. In terms of measures, you know, the measures that are developed would apply as they are developed through the regulatory process, and some of those that are outlined in the new bill. But it is different, but at the same time, it allows for an emphasis on work experience that is a bit stronger than we have in current law.
So, Mala,
go ahead.
No, go ahead, Ben. I'm sorry.
I was just wondering, when you say the measures that are developed in the bill, are those program specific, or are those cutting across all of those work experience types of programs?
It would, I mean, there would be all the measures that are developed across the elements. And then I think in terms of, summer employment, and I mean, there would be placement. I think they would be somewhat the same, but a little different depending on the type of work experience. So there would be placement, wages. I think that the categories would be the same, but the different types of experiences would be a little different. So the measurements may be slightly different, but I think overall in the categories they would be the same.
Mala and Jen, I am curious, do you guys, I mean, I know you support this change, but do you feel like it's going to help, is it helping organizations do what they're already doing better, or do you think that this is actually going to drive organizations to have to do new, different things?
I think, I mean, it would be a little bit, I mean, of both. I mean, we support this. We had a provision around this issue in our recommendations. I think depending on the community, it might help to support some of the things that groups are doing. But in other areas, it may push communities to implement some of these experiences, and they will have to do some thinking about it. I think it could be challenging on the funding side, depending on the size of the community and whether there are other investments in paid work experiences and if there's funding that they can leverage. There are many communities within our membership that do currently do provide some of these work experiences, but they don't necessarily provide them through WIA.
Mm-hmm.
Right, I think this is Jen from YI. I think it would be an interesting question to reach out to some of our partners to find out more about.
Yeah, because I think it could be a challenge for some areas that haven't been able to implement these types of programs, and for others that are doing it, it provides an opportunity for some more innovation and expansion.
That's great. Thank you.
All right. Our next question is from Maggie Severns. Maggie, you can go ahead. Hi, thanks so much for holding this call. I had a question for y'all about the authorization levels. I was just curious if you feel like that will steer funding for better or for worse in the coming years, or how you feel about those being added to the bill.
So I'm happy to go first, but others may have opinions too. So from National Skills Coalition's perspective, I do think that it has the potential to be a good signaling effect. The fact that it does go back up to 2010 levels by 2017, and then above 2010 levels, well, let's see, it's better than if it had gone down, right? But I do think in a very fundamental way, sort of, in some ways, it doesn't matter because there is not enough money under the caps. There is not enough money under sequestration to go up to those funding levels. There just isn't. And if they did try to go up under those funding levels, they would have to take the money from other programs under the Labor H bill, and that's not going to happen. And now we've got these other big gaps, like with the unaccompanied minor children, unaccompanied alien minors, I'm sorry, where we know we have about $1.5 billion shortfall now. So that's, I do appreciate like I said, the signal that it sends that the authorizers see these programs as valuable and want the funding levels to go up. But at the end of the day, we have to undo this bigger problem that we have with the austerity frame. I will also say, and this kind of picks up on something that Mala and Jennifer were saying, these workforce development programs are badly underfunded. They have been badly underfunded for years and years and years. And so even going up to these funding levels, if we were able to get to the, sort of the uptick funding levels that are laid out in the bill, it's still not enough money to do the kinds of things to serve low-skilled people, all that great stuff around transitional jobs and career pathways, or to build capacity for industry partnerships. It's good to see that this is all included in the bill, but in some ways we're asking the system to do more with no new funding for the first 2 years, or with some more funding as we go into the out years if we manage to get it. But it's not enough to meet the need, right? So too many people right now have to choose between serving a lot of people with lower cost services or serving a few people with higher cost services. And of course, highly varied people tend to need more and more expensive services. So until there's some sort of fundamental rethinking about how we fund investments in human capital, including workforce development, there's just not enough money in the system, even with the increased authorization. If we manage to get that, which unless something changes, we won't, it still would not provide the resources that we need to do the kinds of things that the bill is signaling. And if others want to comment on that as well, please do.
And just to be crystal clear, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I wasn't sure if I was muted. You're saying that the funding levels that are in this are too high to be funded by, under the Ryan Murray sequester cap levels.
Well, so anything is possible, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that would be great. I would love to see that happen. But you can look at labor age this year, and we've got serious problems this year, and it only gets worse as we go each year, right? The caps and the sequester just under labor age, which is where these programs are funded, there just is not enough money. So are you going to take money from the CDC? Are you going to take money from NIH to pay for these increases in funding? I cannot advocate for those. Those are also important programs. So until we get out of this austerity frame, the overall funding levels are just too low. So I don't know how the appropriators would find the money to pay for these increases to take us back up to 2010 or even above 2010. That would be great. I would love to see that happen, but I don't know if the appropriators will be able to do that.
Mm-hmm. All right, thanks, Maggie. Our next question is from Michael Peluso. Michael, you can go ahead.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
yep.
go ahead.
Hi there. First question, I understand you folks are a little more focused on Title I and II. I'm hailing from Title IV, the VR programs. So first, data question. Does legislation do anything to smooth the path for WIOA partners to gain access to unemployment wage data on the state level? And has there been any consideration to leveraging IRS data?
Rachel, then?
Sure, I can take that. Yeah, that's a really good question. So the bill does not do something like mandate that states have to make their UI wage records available for performance reporting for the partner, the WIOA program specifically, but there is that that requirement in, I think it's section 116, the accountability section, that now extends to all the programs that says that the performance indicators should be measured using wage records. So that's a pretty strong signal and pretty good leverage for the VR programs, as well as adult education and some of the other programs, to approach their state workforce agencies and say, okay, this is in the bill that this is how we're supposed to be measuring performance. We're all subject to the same measures. We're all supposed to be using wage records. We need to start getting our sharing agreements in order. So I think that is good leverage to get that done on the state level.
Okay, good. I would just, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead. I know it's not always that easy.
That's what I was going to say. In our experience, labor was very proprietary about their data. And when we got to issues like identifying employers, that was really problematic for labor, and that the data would only be sorted based on sectors that didn't really, that were so broad that it really lost a lot in translation. So it might be something for us to all look toward in regulation as they develop regulations, and maybe get a little bit more explicit about an expectation that, we'll work together on the state level. Another question. Yeah,
sorry, and your IRS, and yeah, I would love to follow up with you offline about that. And the IRS data that has come up, in several contexts, I don't think we're there in terms of thinking about a federal match for performance reporting for this set of programs, but the federal agencies are kind of continuing to toss around ideas about how to use their data sets better.
Yeah, I'm sure there's security concerns and all that, but obviously IRS data would be a lot more targeted. And this is back to the broader question that you may not be able to answer, but with regard to the Unified State Plan in Title I particularly, but can you talk a little bit about the interface with Title IV? It was only a cursory read, but my understanding was the separate plan, if you will, the VR portion, could still be somewhat distinct from Title I, or am I wrong about that?
Does anybody know the answer to that? I have no real expertise on the VR title. I'm sorry.
That's maybe okay.
Has anybody else looked at that? I think you may have stumped the panel.
Okay, no problem.
We can follow up, though, if you want to send, you can send me an email or Angela H at nationalskillscoalition.org an email, and we can try and track it down for you.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Okay. The next question is from Greg Hirschfield. Greg, you can go ahead.
Hi. I was just curious what effect the WIAC will have on policy councils.
Rachel Zinn.
Sorry, one more time.
Oh, sorry. I was curious what effect the WIAC will have on policy councils.
Policy councils. Can you say a little more?
Like the OES, CES.
Oh, okay. So that's not quite clear in the bill. I think that's one of the things that would have to be worked out through implementation. It seems like the main purpose of establishing the advisory council in the bill was more to formalize that relationship and be able to bring in a broader array of stakeholders from the states. So I think there's probably still going to be a role for the the federal advisory councils, the policy councils. But yeah, it's not, the bill isn't prescriptive about how that interface happens. That's going to be one of those details that gets worked out in implementation.
Great, thanks.
Okay, our next call is from Sally Stevens. Sally, you can go ahead.
Hi, yeah, this is Sally Stevens down in New Orleans. I work with a lot of low-income people in terms of worker-owned businesses, and we're trying to establish, some scalability and, in terms of worker-owned businesses. And so we're doing some training, but I'm wondering, I mean, aside from maybe the apprenticeship model, I'm just wondering where there is space within all of this to do some training in shared entrepreneurship and self-employment within this movement.
So I'm not an expert on some of the entrepreneur and self-employment efforts. I will say WIOA continues the tradition on WIA in that there is a lot of flexibility under the bill, right? There's a lot of capacity at the state and local level to prioritize or to partner with local organizations to do different kinds of training models, to target different industries that are important to the local economy. So the reality is there's probably nothing in this legislation that would stop or otherwise prohibit you from doing the kind of training that you're interested in. I think the challenge is, again, one, there's always capacity issues, but two, how do you work with your local WIB and with your local one-stop center to build the training program, to build the capacity, to make sure it's connected to people who are coming through the one-stop center. So, I think you can do it if you have support in the local community. I think the challenge for you will be to build that support. But the law, I don't think that the law would prohibit it. I think there's interest in promoting entrepreneurship. So it's just probably connecting the dots a little bit.
Yeah, that is the point that I've been dealing with down here, is trying to get the local workforce investment board interested in this notion, and that there are many people at the job center that, are interested in this, but there's that disconnect between workers and the Workforce Investment Board. There's a lack of communication there. So I don't know if you have any advice for that or not, but
I'm happy to follow up with you offline, maybe. I probably cannot be as helpful as you need, but I would be happy to talk to you some more about it.
All right.
Thank you.
Sure.
And moving on to our final question from Carol Rayburn-Kofer. Carol, you can go ahead.
And my question is related to the public reporting requirement. I know this is probably not popular for some folks, but being in a state that is living through a data transition, what's the possibility that a national data management system will be developed which will allow streamlining this process versus every state developing their own system?
So I think right now it is not great, if that were to be my guess. As I said, the federal agencies are continuing to explore how they can better use their data systems, but there's been so much pushback in Congress and by the public in having larger collections of federal data that it seems like it would be a very big lift. So I think it's not so much a technical problem at this point, it's more of a political challenge. So I think the federal agencies are committed to making this as easy as possible for states and supporting states as they do this. But I think everyone feels like at this point it's a very heavy political lift to try to think about a national system. I wouldn't count it out, but I don't see it coming, in the next month, for example.
So basically, because it makes sense, it probably won't happen. But it does raise those training providers, their reporting into that system is going, or whatever system that all the different states have, it's going to be quite an undertaking.
Yes, and I think there is recognition of that, but I think the feeling behind the bill was that that's, this is important enough that we are able to look at results that even though that's going to be a logistical challenge, we should figure it out. But there are some movements to get a national system, so we'll see what happens with that over the next, I would say, year or so.
Okay, thank you. So we are at the end of our scheduled time. I want to thank all of the panelists for doing this and for providing such great information. And everybody who's on the call, thank you for spending 90 minutes with us talking about this bill. If we didn't get to your question, please don't hesitate to email. Again, your best bet is to email Angela Hanks at angelah@nationalskillscoalition.org, and she will sort through the questions and get them sent around to the person who can best help you. You also, though, in the PowerPoint presentations, you do have contact information for each of the speakers, so you should also feel free to contact anybody directly as well. So thank you very much.